Good evening and welcome to Monday Night Travel with Rick Steves Europe. My name is Lisa Friend and I'm delighted to be your moderator this evening as we stow along in Cameron Hewitt's rucksack from his 3 trips to Europe this year. Now, I have the pleasure to introduce our guest for the evening, our longtime colleague and collaborator, Cameron Hewitt. Cameron, welcome back to the show.
Hey Lisa, how you doing? Thanks for having me again.
I am very happy to have you again. You are one of the 5 Timers Club, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think at least 5 times. I forgot my gold jacket.
Yeah, we need that. So, Cameron, you have been a tour guide, a guidebook researcher. You've taught travel classes for us. What do you find in your job to be the most fulfilling part of your role?
It's a good question. I think the thing I really enjoy is the challenge of writing new guidebook material, going to a place maybe I've never been before and having to really quickly understand the place and figure out what's important and how to explain that to travelers. And it's a lot of very hard work, but it's extremely satisfying to put it into writing. And at the end of the day, you know you've got this guidebook chapter that a lot of people can use and enjoy.
I think that's the key to what makes our guidebooks so good is that you understand them and then you're good at explaining them to the readers. I really appreciate that as somebody who uses the guidebooks myself.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. I'm going to disappear behind the scenes, and this show is all yours now.
Sounds good. Well, folks, thank you for having me back again on Monday Night Travel. And I think we should get started. I've got an awful lot of, oops, hold on. I've got an awful lot of travel to cover. I'm going to be talking tonight about all of my travels from 2025. Now, that's 10 weeks of travel over from starting in September, in April, all the way to September on 3 different trips, traveling in 7 different countries. So I started out in the spring going to Spain and Morocco. And then in the summer, I was in England and Denmark. And then in the fall, I was in Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. So this is a lot to cover in about an hour, plus a little time for some Q&A. So I'm going to rush through it. And rather than try to give you a comprehensive, what I did in the 10 weeks I was in Europe this year, I'm really going to focus on some of my favorite memories, some key themes that came out, some things that inspired me, some details I thought were interesting, hopefully some inspiration for if you're planning a trip for yourself for next year. And I am, as the title of this talk suggests, going to also consider the fact that we live in a very politicized time, and that has, in a lot of ways, kind of changed the way that we experience travel, I think. But let's start off with some light, fun beauty shots from Andalucía. I took off on, I think it was April 1st, and I went to the city of Sevilla in Andalucía, the southern part of Spain, very traditional part of Spain. I was really focused on this particular guidebook research tip on some of the smaller towns, the hill towns. This is Ronda, for example. It's a great place to go on like a road trip. I had a car. My wife joined me for about a week, and we went to conquer beautiful castles overlooking hill towns. And then just down the road, there'd be another hill town with a spectacular view, charming squares, flower-draped lanes. And boy, I don't think there's anywhere better for magic hour and those beautiful hours after sunset than these back lanes of Andalusia, where you can just see the way the color of the light changes as the sun sets lower and lower in the sky. Really magical. I think Andalusia is especially nice in the springtime. Everywhere we went, we smelled orange blossoms. That's the time of year for the orange blossoms there. And there was one day I came around the corner and there was this park with several orange trees, and this city crew was just cutting all these oranges off the trees and then raking them up and just dumping them in the back of a garbage truck, which I thought it kind of blew my mind because to me, orange trees are exotic. To them, it's just another plant that they have to deal with. But that's a real treat for being in Andalusia in springtime. Another treat, and this is something you either might want to try to find or try to avoid, is if you coincide with Semana Santa, which is the Holy Week between Palm Sunday and Easter. I actually planned my trip pretty carefully to miss Holy Week because, as I alluded to talking to Lisa, I had a lot of guidebook work to do. And Holy Week completely closes off every town and city in Andalusia. They have processions from all these different churches that go all the way through town. It's an absolute traffic jam, human traffic jam. And I plan to specifically depart Spain on the day after Palm Sunday because I didn't want to be around for the crowds. I kind of very strategically avoided it. But that meant I did have one evening to really enjoy these Semana Santa processions, which is really something to see if you happen to be in Spain in the springtime. That is also a reminder that Andalucía is an intensely Catholic area. So you also have some gorgeous, stunning Catholic architecture, some of the most beautiful church interiors you're going to see anywhere. But it's also important to remember the history of this has a very strong Muslim component. This was part of Al-Andalus, this very enlightened empire of the Moors who took over much of Iberia at a time when most of Europe was kind of suffering through the Dark Ages and was kind of primitive and not very advanced. A lot of the high learning, a lot of the education, a lot of the deep thought took place here in Al-Andalus. And two of my favorite sites anywhere in Europe, it was a real treat for me to go back to those on this trip. And you've probably been to these if you've been to this part of Spain. One is the Alhambra, this spectacular Moorish palace in Granada. I mean, this place is just absolutely breathtaking. You kind of get goosebumps looking at these pictures. This incredible palace that's sort of along the crest of this hill. Beautiful courtyards with incredible details. I just loved all of the intricate details of this Moorish architecture. You walk into the room and you look up and here's this stunning ceiling under the dome with all of these sort of stalactites hanging down. Incredible Moorish architecture and of course beautiful gardens as well. And then my other favorite site, and maybe one of my favorite sites in all of Europe, is La Mezquita, which is this spectacular mosque turned church in Cordoba. First of all, you walk in and then you're in the mosque part of the building. It's this sort of endless sea of double arches, Islamic double arches. You kind of look in one direction and look in the other direction, and you feel like it's sort of infinity everywhere around you. But then you turn a corner and you find this incredible Baroque church that was later built right in the middle of this mosque and that stretches up towards the heavens. It really kind of captures this sort of jostling of two different cultures and two different faiths here in this part of southern Spain. Those are two incredible highlights of any trip. I also love making new discoveries. And one of the things I was doing this year in southern Spain, we added the city of Cadiz to our Best of Spain tours. And we decided we should also cover this in our guidebook. So I went and spent a couple days really getting to know this wonderful, wonderful city on the south coast of Spain. It's right kind of near the Strait of Gibraltar, very strategic military port, remarkable history. There's some beautiful buildings. There's a gorgeous cathedral here in Cadiz. But the thing I loved about this city is it's the kind of city you just kind of get swallowed up in. And there's these beautiful squares and walking streets and fine old mansions and a spectacular market. I love walking through the fish market here. Like a lot of coastal towns, Cadiz is very much tied to the sea. And I love learning these little nuggets of detail that I can put in our guidebooks. This was one of my favorite details here from Cadiz. My local guide pointed out a lot of the buildings in Cadiz, including the cathedral I just showed you, is the color of these oysters that are still harvested off the coast of Cadiz. And he explained that much of Cadiz is built upon an oyster stone. It's actually a naturally occurring stone that's made of compressed, eons and eons of compressed oyster shells. And they would go and quarry it out of the sea and they would use it to build a lot of the city. So if you're walking down the streets of Cadiz, suddenly you'd literally see a little bit of an oyster shell kind of embedded in the side of a wall. I love those little tangible details when I'm traveling, especially to put in the guidebook. The other thing that I enjoyed in Cadiz was this is sort of your classic travel tip. If you're at the market and there are two churro stands and one of them has a long line and the other one is empty and the guy looks kind of lonely, what do? You get in the long line because, you know, locals understand those are the best churros. And sure enough, that was a great tip in this case. My wife enjoyed some really nice churros con chocolate here at the market in Cadiz. Just to wrap up the Spain part of the trip, headed down to the beaches of the south coast, the beautiful town of Tarifa with its windsurfers. Of course, you got to try some paella, and climbing up to the top of the Rock of Gibraltar, which is, it's kind of a long story, but you probably know this is a very interesting little piece of land in a very complicated part of kind of where cultures mix. This is technically part of the United Kingdom, but everything around you that you can see is Spain. And then just across the water is Morocco. So you really have a feeling here in this southern tip of Spain, like you're at the confluence of three different cultures. Speaking of which, that's where I headed next. I took the boat across, just basically a 40-minute boat ride to the city of Tangier in Morocco. And this is the port of Tangier. And for me, one of the really interesting things about going back to Tangier, this was the first time I'd been back in about 14 years. And that Morocco has a very a dynamic, relatively young king who's really excited about modernizing the country of Morocco, especially Tangier. So there's been a tremendous amount of investment. You can see before you is the ferry terminal here in Tangier, which used to be kind of old and dilapidated and dumpy, and now it's this beautiful modern facility. And my favorite example of this is the first time I went to Morocco, to Tangier 14 years ago, I was met at the boat dock by a tour guide named Aziz Benami, who we recommended our guidebook. And he was wearing the traditional Moroccan robes. So he came up to me looking very much like a traditional Moroccan. And here, 14 years later, I stepped off basically the same boat at the same port. And this time, instead, Aziz was dressed in this very dapper, fancy suit with the fedora. And he was really eager to show me how Morocco, Tangier, is traditional, but it's also very modern and it's really moving into the future. So that's a really important part, I think, of understanding when you're going to, especially Tangier, but Morocco in general. They're very proud of how they're modernizing. They have a bullet train now in Morocco. I didn't get to take this, but it's faster than any train in the United States. It's just as fast as the bullet trains in France, and they're expanding the network quickly. These are not things you associate with Morocco necessarily, but it was fun to see all of the changes and get our guidebooks up to date as well. Of course, Tangier also still has its very traditional parts, and I really enjoyed updating our guidebook chapter. We don't have a Morocco book, but we have a Spain book. And because it's so close to Spain, we decided to include Tangier. And it was great to update our information on Tangier. And anytime you're in Morocco, you're on a photo safari, whether you want to be or not. There's just beautiful images everywhere. And of course, as with anywhere, the people that you connect with are really a big part of the trip. This is a gentleman named Yassine. I walked into, believe it or not, there's an Anglican church, St. Andrew's Anglican Church, that was built on land that the Sultan gave to Queen Victoria. And I walked into this church, and it's a fascinating place because the architecture is very much Islamic, it's very much Moroccan style, but it's very much a Catholic, not a Catholic, an Anglican, a Christian church. And so, for example, the Lord's Prayer is etched into the arch using Arabic letters. And Yassine is one of these sort of caretakers that you have at some of these sites. And all day long, he sits there, and when someone walks in, he greets them very warmly and is very happy to show them around this place that he's very, very proud to be the caretaker of. I love connecting with people. And another person I really enjoyed connecting with on this trip was Lucas Peters. If you are a frequent viewer of Monday Night Travel, you will recognize Lucas. He's done several programs for us here on Monday Night Travel, including just a few weeks ago. I contacted Lucas, who lives in Tangier, when I was planning on this trip. And I said, I'm thinking about seeing a little more, going beyond Tangier. I want to see more of Morocco. Do you have any advice? And he said, geez, I have to go to some of those places for my guidebook work. Do you want to just tag along with me and we'll go on a road trip? And so that's what we did. Lucas and I went on a quick road trip around Morocco, seeing poppy fields and amazing Roman ruins and some gorgeous kind of historic hill towns kind of tucked between the mountains here in Morocco. And he took me to some other beautiful places, just to places that have been on my list and maybe are on your list too. One of them is this gorgeous town called Chefchaouen, and it's called the Blue Pearl of Morocco because the entire town is painted in every shade of blue that you can imagine. And again, I'm not going to say much in terms of the history and culture of this place. This is one of those, just let it wash over you. Enjoy the beautiful scenery, the incredible colors, the perfect street scenes. I mean, this place just absolutely blew my mind. I think I took as many pictures in this town as I did in entire countries this year. Just a really wonderful place, even to spend a short time. From there, we went on to what I thought for me was the most interesting city in Morocco. It's called Fez. And what's really interesting about Fez is that the old town of Fez is considered the biggest old town in the world. The Medina of Fez contains something like 100,000 residents, which is kind of mind-boggling. All the old towns in Europe, they might have a couple of thousand. In Dubrovnik, there's maybe a couple of thousand people living in the old town. Fez has 100,000 people living in the old town, still living often very traditional lifestyles. So this was an amazing place just to explore and get lost in the back lanes. And my general strategy in Morocco was to hire a local guide when I first got there to get my bearings, and they would take me to some of the major sites and explain some of the history and the culture. And some of the more interesting sites that I wouldn't have quite known what to do with on my own. This is in Fez, this really incredible tannery that they have, that they continue to process leather in a traditional way, using all of these different vats filled with different chemicals and different formulations. In fact, it's a kind of an overpowering smell. So they give you a little sprig of mint that you're supposed to hold under your nose as you visit this place. That's the sort of thing it's really great to have a tour guide for. But then I would just love to get lost in the back lanes and again, go on a photo safari, sort of Lucas even suggested, put your camera away sometimes and just let yourself get swallowed up by a place like Fez. And I had a wonderful time just sort of following my instincts and getting lost intentionally. Getting lost intentionally is very easy in Fez, and so is getting lost unintentionally. This is one of the most confusing places I've ever had to navigate. Now, fortunately, that was kind of my agenda. If I was with my guide, he could help me kind of see the stuff I wanted to see. The rest of the time, I sort of wanted to get lost. And boy, did I succeed. There's a whole complicated system of signs that are supposed to help you figure out if it's a square sign like this one, it means that the street kind of connects through to another street. If it's more like a stop sign shaped sign, it means that it's a dead end. But I found that those were not reliable at all. I also found Google Maps had no idea how to get to where I was going. And I will say, if you've been to Morocco, you know that if you're ever a tourist who's kind of lost, you'll have people approaching you all the time to help you. And some of them are there partly because they genuinely want to help you. But in a lot of cases, that's kind of a side hustle that they have where they want to show the tourist around and then they ask for a little tip at the end. So you give them a couple of dollars worth for helping you find your way out of a confusing place. And I was very proud of the fact that I was going to kind of do it on my own, but there came one day that I just kept going after dead end lane after dead end lane after dead end lane. And about the fifth time I found myself in the same little cul-de-sac, I finally was like, someone needs to get me out of here because I have no idea how to get out. And there were these three little girls playing at a stoop, and I kind of walked up to them looking confused. And this one little girl said, "Follow me." She marched off through the Medina, and I just kind of could barely keep up. I went marching after her, and sure enough, she took me directly back to one of the main streets so I could get reoriented. And I gave her a couple of bucks, and I thought that was a good investment for her to bail me out of my confusion. So that's a very typical, I think, Moroccan experience when you travel here. By the way, I'm just doing a very once over lightly of my trip in Morocco, and I will mention that Rick went on a really fantastic trip to Morocco, which Lucas Peters helped coordinate for him. And not that long ago, Rick did a great trip report from his trip to Morocco. So if you want more than just this 5 minutes, if you want a whole hour plus of Rick telling you all the ins and outs, make sure you check out that Monday Night Travel that Rick did of his Moroccan trip report. I think Lucas Peters also has done a Moroccan Monday Night Travel. So there's lots of great information if you want more details. In my case, my last stop in Morocco was the city of Marrakesh, which I really enjoyed. This is where a lot of people go. If it's the one place they go in Morocco, it'll probably be Marrakesh. I did find it a little more crowded, a little more touristy, but also just really fascinating. And like every other place I went there, really impressive. And like every other place that I went there, I started out with a tour guide who kind of showed me around and made sure I got to see all of the major sites. And then I just got lost in all the markets and all the back streets and really enjoyed just letting my camera guide me through the streets of Morocco. And enjoying being in this place that's so very different from back home. I really enjoyed every day that I spent in Morocco. Just was full of vivid images and, of course, also great food and wonderful, friendly people. It was really, really a highlight. Marrakesh, if you've been there, if you know much about it, has an absolutely gigantic main square, kind of this mind-bogglingly big and chaotic main square, which you're kind of drawn to. I kept kind of passing through here just to go people watching. And it can be really overwhelming. In fact, you kind of don't know where to look. People from every different culture, every subgroup within Morocco, people from all over Africa, people from all over, tourists from all over Europe and all over the world are all kind of in this same space together. So this was a really fun aspect, I think, of traveling in Morocco. There's a lot of very tempting looking food stands here, but I wasn't sure which food stands were actually the right food stands, which ones I should be careful of. And so one of my tips I would say for a place like this is I took a food tour in Marrakesh, and it turned out to be a great idea because all of these things I would see as I walk by and I'd say, that looks good, but I'm not sure if I should risk it. Well, the food tour people have a pretty good sense of which places have a good reputation. And in one evening, I was able to go to all sorts of different food options and have some confidence that they'd been well selected and really get a nice sampling of Moroccan food. This is a sort of a donut that's available on the streets of Morocco. So I really enjoyed my time in Morocco and my time in Spain. And so we're kind of at the end of trip one. I told you this was kind of a blitz trip through my 2025 travels. And when I got home from this trip, everyone asked me kind of what do you think this is? I get asked this a lot. What's the big trend this year in travel? What trends are you noticing? What's different? And I've got to say the biggest trend for me this year in travel is our president, is the Trump presidency. I think for a lot of us travelers who really value building bridges over building walls, This is a really challenging time to be out there in the world. And I think a lot of Americans are kind of embarrassed when they go to Europe because they know that the Trump approach to things can be very much out of step with sort of the mainstream European way of doing things. It kind of violates European values in a lot of ways. And so if you're someone like I am, who when I travel, I try to be a temporary European and really kind of go with the flow and understand what matters to people over there. It's especially hard to see the way that Trump guides our country being so much at odds with that. In fact, this was, I think, something weighing on a lot of our minds early in the year before the travel year started. And if you follow our Monday Night Travel, you might know back on Inauguration Day, I teamed up with Ben Curtis and we co-hosted a presentation basically doing interviews with four of our European guides and kind of asking them, what do you think about Trump? What are your impressions? So I would also recommend you check that out if you're curious about this topic. It was really interesting to hear from four different corners of Europe, four different people with very different perspectives and different opinions. But it was all really thoughtful. And so I would say when I headed out to Europe this spring, that was one of the big questions on my mind was, how will Americans be received? Will we be received differently? I think, like I said, a lot of us had some self-consciousness and we were worried, like, are Europeans going to be frustrated with us? Are they going to be mad at us, treat us unkindly? I will say from day one in Spain all the way through my 10 weeks of travel, I found that was not the case. In fact, I was really pleased that Europeans treated me just like they always have, which is to say most of the time very well and occasionally a little impatiently, but I didn't sense it was because of my Americanness. I was reminded of what I've learned in past times when American politics were kind of at odds with European politics, which is that I think Europeans do a really good job of seeing people as individuals. They kind of respect us as people, not necessarily as representatives of our government. Frankly, I think Europeans are a little more savvy about that than Americans are. I think we tend to paint countries with a broad brush. If we're mad at their leadership, we're mad at the whole country. Europeans are a little more nuanced and have a little more wisdom about that. And I think it's because in their history, they've gone through a lot of periods, and in some cases are going through periods now where they're facing or have faced challenges on the political scene. They've been dealt with political leadership that they didn't necessarily agree with. So I think they have a pretty good understanding that people are not their leadership and vice versa. And as I traveled through Europe this year, what I sort of came down to was I think two things can be true at the same time. I think it really is true that Europeans are concerned about what's going on in the US politically. They are concerned about Trump. I mentioned earlier, there's things that Trump does that are really in opposition to European values. A great example on a global scale would be climate change. Europeans, that's sort of a settled conversation in Europe. They accept that climate change is real, it's important, it needs to be addressed. It's been caused by humans, and they are really aggressively trying to do what they can to mitigate the impacts of carbon emission and just to try to slow what's going on to our planet, all these crises that are popping up with our climate. And then on a personal level, I think a lot of Europeans are understandably very concerned about the impact of the tariffs and the trade war. I talked to a lot of Europeans who are personally being impacted by some of these new tariffs, who have a lot of customers in the US. They do a lot of exporting, and it makes their lives a lot harder. I just saw just today, Trump has announced he's planning on imposing a 107% tariff on Italian pasta. So if you're an Italian pasta lover, your pasta is going to cost double pretty soon. So I think it's understandable that Europeans are concerned about this. At the same time, what I realized was even if Europeans are concerned about it, it's still something that's happening far away. And they're really more concerned about what's going on in their own lives than they are what's going on in the US, which in a way was a little bit of a relief. They're not as caught up in this as we are. And I think the best example of that actually was on my very first day when I got to Spain. I was on a beautiful square in Sevilla at an outdoor cafe talking to one of our favorite local guides. And I was kind of asking her about this, and are you all worried about this? And they're like, oh yeah, we hear about Trump a lot. We're kind of concerned about it. And so then I went on a little bit of a rant about Elon Musk, because this was right in the peak of the Doge movement and all these government workers being laid off. And she said, wait, Elon who? And I thought, oh, wow, that's really interesting. It reminded me that as Americans traveling, I think we have a tendency to be a little narcissistic, right? We think that everyone in the world is all wrapped up in everything that's happening here. They're aware of what's happening here. They're concerned about it. But in Sevilla that week, they were a lot more concerned about whether their Semana Santa parades would get rained out than they were about what Elon Musk was doing across the Atlantic. So I thought that was a really healthy perspective. And I guess I would say traveling in a time, if you are somebody like I am, who has a lot of concerns about what's going on in our country, you could make a case this is a more important time to travel than ever, if only for your own mental health. I found it was really refreshing for me to get away from the constant barrage of headlines and to get a different perspective and to talk to people in other places and hear what was going on in their countries and to hear their perspective on what was going on in my country. And then you can bring that information back and share it with your fellow Americans, which is sort of what I'm doing here tonight. I think it's very important for us to remain engaged, but I also think occasionally it's okay to get a little bit of an escape, especially with there's so many things in this world that we have no control or influence over, and we all kind of need a break from it sometimes. And it's not just a hedonistic break. Like I said, it can actually be a really important recalibration of perspective and really get some insight, some fresh insight on how to wrangle with what's going on in our country right now. So that's just sort of my take based on all of my travels this year, but it all really kind of was crystallized in that first trip, even to Spain and Morocco. I'm going to jump right into my second trip. So as fast as this transition seems, imagine I was only home, I think, for about 4 or 5 weeks between trips, which was just long enough to have some time with my wife and my cats and catch up on some stuff at the office. But next thing I knew, I was on a plane again. And my second trip, which was in late May through early June, I got to go to a couple of my favorite countries, actually, northern part of England and then also to Denmark. So let me tell you a little bit about some of my highlights from that second trip. I started out in York, which is this wonderful city with a spectacular cathedral in northern England. And boy, going from the souks and the medinas of Morocco to the shambles of York, boy, talk about an abrupt transition. And I will say that's one of the things I love about my job. It's always kind of a grab bag, and that culture shock feels really good when you let yourself lean into it. I had a great time in North England. Just very quickly, I did a road trip. I went to the historic university city of Durham, which has one of the greatest Norman or Romanesque cathedrals in England. I went to Holy Island, also known as Lindisfarne, Bamborough Castle, another castle called Alnwick, and I really got lucky going to Alnwick Castle. It's one of these funny things that happens when you travel, when you write guidebooks. I was actually going to Holy Island, which you could only access by a tidal causeway. And it turned out the tide was in, so I couldn't cross the causeway to Holy Island, and I had about 2 hours to kill. And I was going to Bamborough Castle, and then I saw on the map, well, there's another castle nearby called Alnwick. So I decided, while I'm at it, why don't I go check out this Alnwick Castle? It turned out it was one of my favorite castles I've been to in England. They do the broomstick training sequence in the Harry Potter movie was actually filmed right here at Alnwick Castle. And so I happened to be in the courtyard when they were doing, little kids can come to the castle and sign up and do a kind of a recreation of the broomstick training. And I thought, well, this is one of those wonderful serendipitous discoveries you have when you do guidebook research. From there, I went over to Hadrian's Wall, this incredible ancient Roman structure that cuts across the northern part of England. And man, I was having such a great time out hiking Hadrian's Wall, doing my guidebook research. It felt great. Parked my car, hiked across fields, got all these great views of these wall forts. And when I got to the point where I was about as far from my car as I was planning to get, all of a sudden this incredible squall blew through. And I mean, it was raining sideways. I was soaking wet in a matter of about 2 minutes. I mean, soaked all the way through my clothes, even though I was wearing a raincoat. And it was just a reminder, especially in England, really anywhere, but especially in England, if you're going to be outside, you just have to kind of expect this. And as I traveled around England on this trip, I would occasionally grouse to people like, "Oh yeah, it's some bad weather here, had bad weather there," and they'd say, "Well, of course you did. That's part of traveling here in the spring." And so I just got used to bundling up. But even so, I had a great time. From there, I continued over to the Lake District and stayed in the beautiful town of Keswick. Lake District, of course, has gorgeous pastoral scenery. But there too, it was a stretch of really awful rain. I had really soaked days those days. And so it was actually a good excuse for the guidebook, to research some rainy day options. So I checked out some fun indoor stuff in the area instead of doing some of the hikes that I might have done in good weather. And one of those was this delightful Keswick Town Museum. And it reminded me, some of my favorite sites in all of Europe are these really endearing small town museums that just have this kind of local pride that wins you over, whether you want to or not. They don't have amazing, incredible, historic, world famous artifacts, but they tell the story of their town in such a beautiful way. For example, here in Keswick, in the Lake District, tourism is a big industry, and they had a copy of the first ever guidebook for people traveling to Keswick and the Lake District from, I think, 1910. And one of my favorite things was they have these musical stones. So someone discovered that these stones that naturally occur in the Lake District are musically resonant, and some person very determinedly whittled down all of the stones to reach the exact proper tone, and then arranged them like a xylophone so you could play songs on these stones that had been kind of tuned to the perfect pitch. I love this kind of stuff, and this was a great rainy day activity in Keswick. From there, as you can see, the weather changed, and I headed to Liverpool. And I have to say, I think Liverpool might be maybe the most underrated destination in the UK. Certainly, it's the most underrated big city in the UK. This is just a fun, fascinating city with really not only the historic industrial stuff, but also some really striking modern architecture, great museums. The thing that most people used to go to Liverpool for, and in a lot of cases still do, is of course the Beatles. And if you want Beatles lore, you're definitely going to find it still in Liverpool. Every year there's a new Beatles attraction that opens up. And I'm a big Beatles fan, so it was fun to be back in Liverpool and to bask in some of that. And one of my other favorite attractions that I did all year was you can actually go on a tour of the boyhood homes of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. You take the train to a suburban train station, they meet you in a little minibus, and they drive you to the two homes. And in each of the homes, a docent meets you, and he gives you this wonderful little super insightful chat. They're incredibly knowledgeable, as if he grew up with these guys, and he tells you all these stories of their childhood, and then he sets you free, and you can walk around in these houses and walk into their bedrooms and their living rooms and their bathrooms. It's really an amazing experience. And as a Beatles fan who thought I knew a lot about the Beatles, boy, I came away some incredible observations. One of the things that kind of a light bulb went off was he was explaining that he reminded me that Paul McCartney and John Lennon both lost their mothers when they were young boys, and they didn't talk about it much, apparently, to each other, so they've been told. But probably there was some unspoken bond. It probably kind of had some underpinning of this incredible collaboration between these two guys that they'd grown up in a few blocks apart in the same, not only a few blocks apart in the same town, but they'd had this same very traumatic formative experience when they were young. That sort of insight you can only get, I think, by going to these really intimate sites in Europe. I think the sort of the home of an artist is a really good type of museum that I really recommend. So I was saying that people used to go to Liverpool sort of only for the Beatles stuff, if they went there at all, and they still can go there for the Beatles stuff. I would say, though, from just an all-around sightseeing perspective and an all-around sort of enjoyable city perspective, Liverpool is just wonderful. There's so much beyond the Beatles. For example, Liverpool famously has two cathedrals. This is the modern, very modern-looking Catholic cathedral, and then across town, about a 10-minute walk away, is this soaring neo-Gothic, very classic Anglican cathedral. And then there's all these super modern museums. A lot of museums have just opened in the last few years. There's just so much to see and do in Liverpool. I was really glad to be back there, and I think we've got it really well covered in our guidebooks. If you're looking for an urban thing to do in your England itinerary, this is really worth considering. Now, while I was in Liverpool or planning my trip to Liverpool, I just kind of looked at the map and I saw a familiar name not too far away. I'm a big fan of the TV show Welcome to Wrexham. If you know this show, it's a show about basically a very hard on its luck former mining town in Wales that had a soccer team that was also very hard on its luck. And a couple of big Hollywood bigwigs actually bought the team and have invested in it, and the team has had more success, and they're hoping that the town will also start to have some success. And it's a really touching true story, a documentary series. And I've been enjoying watching it for a few years. And I realized, geez, I'm a half hour away in Liverpool. Why don't I go over to Wrexham for a couple hours? And so that's what I did. It was really fun to see. If you've seen the show, you recognize this monument to these miners, which is in the opening credits. Got to see some murals of some of the soccer stars like Super Paul Mullen. I even went into the Turf Pub, and I snuck this picture of Wayne, the famous barkeeper, who you've probably seen if you've seen Welcome to Wrexham, actually poured me a pint, which I thought was pretty amazing. It's a real pub. When the camera crews aren't there, it just feels like any other English pub. You'd never know it. So this was a fun way to kind of take something I was interested in and fit it into a trip. And I hope you'll take some inspiration to kind of think outside the box when you're planning your trip. I always challenge people to sort of let yourself sort of daydream about the place you've always wanted to go to. And if you happen to notice it's not that far from another place you're going, why not go there? What are you waiting for? You know, this was a super rewarding 3 or 4 hours of a busy day in Liverpool. And I really enjoyed getting to see the real places. So now when I watch the new season of Welcome to Wrexham, I really can put myself there mentally. Also on this same trip, I wrapped up my trip in Liverpool and I flew straight to Copenhagen for the next part of this summer trip, and that was around Denmark. I only had a short time in Copenhagen itself, but boy, this is just, I think, one of the most enjoyable, all around enjoyable cities to just experience and to spend time in. I had such a great time in my few days here. And I love making new discoveries. Historically, traditionally, there have always been these huge tour boats that go around the harbor. And I've noticed this in other places too. There's a trend now that there's a smaller alternative. It costs more money, but not ridiculously more money. And instead of being on a boat with 100 people, you're on a boat with 12 people. And it's a much more casual experience. The guiding is more personal. You can get to places that you wouldn't be able to get to on the big boats. And it gives you a great look at I've showed you some pictures of the traditional part of Copenhagen. This is a good chance to see the modern part of Copenhagen. Copenhagen's really developing out along its harbor. In fact, some of the most interesting developments are quite a ways out from the city center. You would not see this unless you go out of your way to get there on one of these boat trips. They're really working on what they call 5-minute cities. This is the new trend among Danish architects. They want to build a community where everything you need is within 5 minutes. Schools, residences, offices, shopping, recreation. They want everyone to be able to get to everything that they need within 5 minutes. This is kind of the idealistic goal. And that includes recreation and swimming. And the other thing they're doing in Copenhagen is they've really worked hard on cleaning the harbor. And they're putting in all these public baths. So on a nice sunny day in Copenhagen, you'll see people in the city center out swimming in their harbor. You might think, well, that probably isn't safe or sanitary, and I wouldn't want to swim in a harbor. Well, they thought of that. And at each of these swimming stations, they have this amazing electronic board that tells you whether it's currently safe to swim in terms of they're constantly testing the toxin levels and the algae levels. And they know whether it's hazardous to your health to swim or not. And on this day, you can see the lights are green. So that means it's safe to swim in the harbor. Maybe on a day where there's higher algae levels, the lights will blink red and it'll tell you for the next 3 days you probably shouldn't go swimming. It does, I think, buy you peace of mind, and it's another great way to see how Copenhagen is making the most of the city that they live in. Now, while I was on this boat trip, we went by the Danish Parliament, and it was a really interesting. Again, I really had politics on the brain while I was on this trip, and it was a really interesting kind of moment hearing about things that we talk about in the U.S. from a very European perspective. So we're floating by the Parliament building, and our guide, who's a very young guy, mid-20s kind of guy, he says, "Oh, well, we have a multi-party system in the Parliament. It's great. I get to vote for exactly what I want." And then they have to work with other parties to make things work. And there was an older couple from the Midwest on the boat with me in the U.S., and they kind of grumbled. They say, "Well, we have two parties in America, and they're both bad. And the Democrats are the worst because they keep raising our taxes and giving it to immigrants, illegal immigrants," is what the guy said. So I'm kind of like, oh, God, here I am trying to be on vacation in a beautiful place, and this is coming up. Our guide, though, I thought really handled it beautifully. And I'll just tell you quickly, I think a lot of you who've traveled in Europe has probably had this experience. It's really refreshing to get a personal testimonial from someone who lives in a society that sees things very differently. And I think Denmark in particular is famous for being a very content society. It's also very highly taxed. It's also has very generous social services. So it's very different from our approach in a lot of the US. And the young guy, 25-year-old guy, said, "Yeah, I understand that." I said, "Yeah, no system is perfect, and our system sure isn't perfect." But he said, I gotta say, I'm required to pay taxes, and I know my taxes are going to go to a lot of different things that I'm not going to use. It's going to go to healthcare, sure, I might use that, but it also goes to people's retirement. I'm not going to need that for a long time. It goes to childcare. I don't need childcare right now, and so forth. He says, but I feel okay about that because I think all of those things make my society stronger. And it's a good investment, and I think a lot of Danes feel this way. My fellow Danes feel this way. It's a good investment to have a stronger society. He said, "I'm not saying our system's perfect. Every system has its flaws, but I feel like even as someone not using those services, it's a good investment." And I thought that was, first of all, it kind of shut up the people who are trying to start a political argument. But I just thought, boy, I think a lot of you who've traveled in Europe, whether you agree with this position or not, you've probably been in that situation where you might have some skepticism about universal health care. And then you talk to someone who has it, and they often will say it's not perfect. It doesn't always work. but when it works, it sure is great. And boy, I wouldn't trade systems with yours. And that was kind of his sentiment. It was like, I know you do it differently. I know our system's not perfect, but I would never trade systems with yours. And I thought that was a really interesting testimonial. And again, I was more attuned to the political stuff this year, so it really, really stuck a chord with me. And I think as you travel, we always talk about at Rick Steves Europe, travel is a political act. Whether or not you agree with all the opinions you hear, and believe me, I hear a lot of opinions among Europeans that I completely agree with. I hear a lot of opinions from Europeans that I totally disagree with. Whether you agree with them or not, that's part of travel, I think, is really trying to understand the way people see things in other places. I think that's the power of travel and bringing it home and giving you a fresh perspective on things back home as well. So Denmark, Copenhagen was another place I did a food tour this year, and it was a great chance to try a variety of traditional Danish foods. Of course, we had to try all the different pastries. We had some smørrebrød, which is like the open-faced sandwiches. We had a sausage, the pølse, the kind of the street hot dog that's so popular in Copenhagen. Again, a food tour can be a good way to just once over lightly try all these different specialties in one go for one price with a guide who's picked the best place for each one. The other thing that's a big trend in Denmark, all of Denmark, not just Copenhagen, that I loved is street food. They're really interested in all different cuisines from around the world. And there's 4 or 5 of these hubs in Copenhagen alone. And then every city around Denmark has their own version of this. It's usually in some old industrial hall that's been converted into a food court. And you walk in and there's probably 15 or 20 different food stalls, and it's not just traditional Danish. It can be tacos, it can be sushi. I had a great African dish at one of them, a Ghanaian dish at one of the places I went. I had a really amazing kind of a Brazilian steak dish at one of the places I went to. And the other thing I like about these street food halls is they're very multi-generational. You feel like it's not just young hipsters, right? It's families. It's grandma taking their grandkids out to eat. This is a really important part of the Danish eating scene these days. I also generally found Denmark has excellent food. I don't necessarily think of Denmark on my list of great food countries. I probably should, of course, because it's the home of the best restaurant in the world, Noma. It's been on the radar as being the pioneer of this new Nordic cooking the last couple of decades. So I probably should have thought of it as a food country. But being there and traveling there and eating there, boy, it's one of the best food countries, I think, anywhere. It's right up there with Italy or France or Hungary, which is another one of my favorite food countries. I ate well everywhere in Denmark. Another thing Denmark is famous for that you might be more familiar with than street food is Legos. Denmark is the birthplace of Legos. And I went to the town of Billund, where I went to Legoland, which is the same amusement park essentially that you have in other places around the world, including the one down in Carlsbad, California. And I liked Legoland, but I was really blown away that in the last 10 years or so, they've built this facility in downtown Billund called the Lego House. And it's kind of like a celebration of Lego. It's not a theme park. It's actually built and maintained by the Lego Corporation to kind of tell the story of Lego and to give people access to just a ridiculous number of Legos. You walk in the door and spiral up this atrium, and there's this massive sculpture of a tree that's made entirely out of Legos. And then you find one section where they have these cityscapes that are made out of Legos with details. I mean, you could spend hours looking at all the little details of these Lego cityscapes. And I think the best part was they say that they have something like 25 million Lego bricks for people to build with. So if you love to build with Legos, they're themed sections, and they kind of have sort of different tasks or challenges in each section. Like here's a prompt for how to build your thing with these Legos, or you can just build whatever you want. And it was just an absolutely delightful experience. The other kind of newish site that I really loved in Denmark, outside of the city of Aarhus, is the Mosegard Museum. And this has actually been there for a long time because it's the place where you can see the Graubollemann, which is actually a corpse that they found that had been preserved in a bog from a prehistoric person that was sacrificed to the bogs hundreds and hundreds of years ago. This remarkably well-preserved body of a person who lived on this earth thousands of years ago. That's always kind of been there, but now they've built this incredible museum around it that just opened a few years ago that basically tells the whole story of humanity from prehistory through the Stone Age and the Iron Age and the Bronze Age, all the way up to the Middle Ages and the Vikings. It's just an absolutely incredible museum. I went to check it out for the book thinking I'd be there for an hour, and I think I was there for 3 or 4 hours. And I see sites very quickly, usually. Just a spectacular site. I was so impressed with between the Lego House and the Mosgard Museum and others, Denmark just has wonderful museums. They do great museums there. And then just my last stop in Denmark, I'll mention. I went to everyone's favorite little Danish island called Ero, which is, if you've been on the Rick Steves West of Scandinavia tour, you spent a couple of nights here. This place is just purely charming. It's just like Rick likes to say, it's like a ship in the bottle, except it's a whole village. It's this beautiful old fishing town with all of these colorful, beautiful homes, and just a great place to kind of be in a very small town in Denmark, right on the water, and enjoy the beauty of the place and really just relax. I'm going to I know this has been a whirlwind so far. I've got one more trip to cover. I'll tell you about my fall trip to the Czech Republic and Hungary. But I think just as a palate cleanser, if you need to stretch a little bit, I asked Lisa, she could kind of dig up a couple of questions for me to answer for a couple of minutes, and then we'll dig back in and finish the tour.
Yes, consider this your intermission. But show
Oh, by
everybody.
the way, this was my souvenir at the Lego house.
I noticed you had that earlier, and I was like,
Yeah.
he's got to show that. It is so charming. Okay, I will give you a couple of quick questions. And this one is super easy, but somebody wanted to know, they didn't understand. How did you get from Fez to Marrakesh?
I took the train. So Lucas drove me from Tangier to Fez, and then there were two choices. You can fly, but the flights aren't every day, and they're all on Ryanair, and this and that. And I could have hired a driver, but I said no, I want to see the countryside. So there was a train that took about 9 to 10 hours. I mentioned there were bullet trains in Morocco. That route does not have a bullet train yet. The bullet train goes from Tangier down to Rabat, the capital, in Casablanca. I think in a couple of years it should go all the way to Marrakesh. It'll make the trip a lot quicker. But I gotta say, that was a really fun 9 or 10 hours on the train. I just thought I'm here in Morocco. I want to see Morocco. I could spend half the day going to the airport on either end, or I could just get on the train downtown and enjoy the view. And that's what I did.
Yeah, sometimes it's so relaxing not to have to repack your liquids and go through all that rigmarole.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this lines up with what you've been talking about. I don't know if you're ready to answer it, but what was the best food that you had on out of these 3 trips?
Oh man, I would say Denmark. Every meal I had in Denmark was good in its own way. I think the food scene in Copenhagen rivals any city in Europe. And my other favorite place is Budapest. I'm not going to talk a lot about the food. I have a lot of other things to talk about in Budapest, but I always just love the food in Budapest. There's great modern Hungarian. I think Hungarian cuisine is spectacular. It's absolutely delicious. Budapest has a lot of great kind of modern Hungarian places. And then the other thing that's really popular in Budapest are modern Israeli or modern Middle Eastern, because there's the former Jewish quarter of Budapest, especially, has a lot of ties to Jewish culture. So there's increasingly a lot of like high-end modern Middle Eastern, modern Israeli restaurants. And I went to 3 of them in like the week I was in Budapest. 2 I'd been to before, one was new, and they were all fantastic. Yeah, I never had a bad meal in Budapest or in Copenhagen.
Oh, fantastic. How do you feel? Do you need any more questions?
Good. No, no, no. I just wanted everyone to get if they needed to run off to the loo or whatever. But I'll wrap up here now. I've got yeah, maybe another 15 minutes or so on my third trip, and then we'll do more questions after. Let me emphasize. So Gabe and Lisa are tracking those questions, and we'll make sure as many as possible are answered at the finish. But for now, let's dig into my third trip. And if you're getting a little bit of cultural whiplash again, just imagine how I feel. This is what my year looks like. My third trip, which I left for right after Labor Day in September, was going back to the Czech Republic and Hungary and a little bit in Slovakia as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about that trip now. And this was kind of my wheelhouse. I'm kind of known as the Central Europe, the Eastern Europe guy at Rick Steves Europe. This has been the part of Europe that I've really specialized in more than anything else in the time that I've been here. And it's always great to be back in Prague, of course, one of the most beautiful historic towns anywhere in Europe. And I'm always looking for new stuff. So the one thing I wanted to tell you about that's relatively new in Prague is they've reopened the National Museum, which was closed for many years for renovation. And it's just spectacular inside. The exhibits are pretty good. The building itself is just stunning and spectacular, and you can go up to the dome at the top of the National Museum and get a fantastic view down Wenceslas Square, and you can see the castle on the horizon. Really, really something special. So anytime I'm in a place like Prague, I'm excited to find something new, But of course, Prague is all about the old. It's about the traditions. It's about things not changing. And that's definitely still the case. It's an incredibly well-preserved town. The other thing that hasn't changed about Prague is it's very crowded. And I would say another big theme of travel these days in general is crowds. A lot of the places I've been to that I've showed you aren't particularly crowded. I think there are parts of South Spain that can be very crowded. There are locations that are crowded. Prague is, though, definitely one of the places that's for a very long time been known for its crowds. And so I didn't spend that much time in Prague on this trip. I wanted to get beyond Prague. And so mainly I want to tell you about some of the other places in the Czech Republic where you can escape some of those crowds. Now, the first couple places I went to are sort of half as crowded as Prague. They're not untouristy, they're just a little less crowded, but they're both really beautiful and worth going to. Český Krumlov, you've probably heard of before. If you're going to go to one place in Prague, in the Czech Republic other than Prague, it's hard to resist Český Krumlov. As you can see, it just looks like a living fairy tale. Beautiful place, amazing castle, and it's any of these places that are sometimes crowded, it's always good advice to go at night. They're much quieter and calmer after dark. After dark, you feel like you get a place like this to yourself, as opposed to midday when there's all these tour groups and day trippers coming in for the day. The next town I went to, which I also really enjoyed, also really well known and kind of touristy, is Karlovy Vary, also known as Carlsbad. This is a beautiful spa town with just spectacular architecture in a wooded valley. And if you're going to go to a spa town like Karlovy Vary, you have to go with the flow and join the traditions. And so one of the traditions is you buy one of these little, I should have brought it out. You buy one of these little ceramic pitchers, and the handle doubles as a kind of a straw, and you walk around filling up your pitcher at all the little natural hot water springs that are scattered around the town center, and then you take a little sip. It's supposed to be very good for you. And there's also there's several spas in Karlovy Vary, but the one I really liked was essentially like a big public swimming pool with warm water on a terrace overlooking the town center. This was just a gorgeous evening where I went and got to go for a swim looking out under the moonlight over Karlovy Vary. So those are great destinations, but if you want to go to the Czech Republic and really dig into some less touristy places, you have to pick up the Rick Steves Prague and the Czech Republic guidebook. And this isn't just a gratuitous plug. This is actually a testimonial because I didn't write that book. This is the one part of Central Europe that I'm not responsible for. This is the responsibility of this gentleman here, Hansa Vihan. If you've seen Rick's shows on the Czech Republic, you've seen Hansa pop up before. He's a good friend of Rick and I and all of us at Rick Steves Europe. We've known him for years and years. He's obviously Czech born and bred, and he really has a passion for lesser known parts of the Czech Republic that, if anything, are more culturally insightful than the big famous places. So most of my trip was actually going on a big road trip to some of Hansa's discoveries. About every 10 or 15 years, one of us will kind of go through behind Hansa and kind of check out these places and refresh him a little bit. And boy, was I impressed with the work Hansa has done on that book, finding untouristy alternatives to Prague. And I would say if you want to go to Europe without the crowds, you can find very few crowds, much lower prices, and every bit as rewarding, if not more so, in a lot of the places that are lesser known in the Czech Republic. One of my favorite places was a town called Mikulov, which is at the center of a beautiful wine growing region in the southern Czech Republic. There's a big, beautiful chateau right in the town center, and it's a great hub for day tripping. So from the town of Mikulov, you can drive about 15 minutes, and you'll be in a castle called Lednica, beautiful chateau in the countryside. And the cellars of Lednica host the Czech Wine Gallery, literally curated by a national board. There's 100 bottles of wine representing the best wines produced in the entire country that are all open for tastings by the bottle. Absolutely incredible. And then about 15, more like 10 minutes from Lednica, you can go to yet another castle, which is completely different, called Valtice. And this is more of an English-style neo-Gothic castle with just a gorgeous, gorgeous interior. One of the nice things about going to an area like this, as opposed to the really famous places, is there were many of these castle tours where I was literally the only non-Czech speaker on the entire tour. Some of these castles don't even offer tours in any language except Czech. So instead of having an English tour every hour, they hand you a written translation of the descriptions that you read as you walk around, which I think kind of adds to the charm. It's really something to be in a castle. You could drive an hour and be at a castle where they have an English tour every 30 minutes and it's all Americans. Or you could go to a castle where you're the only American out of 45 Czech people reading the descriptions and having a really authentic experience. I really can't say enough about, I think this approach is beautiful. Another town that I would recommend that's like this, that I went to a little later in my trip, is in Hungary. It's another one of these great undiscovered towns called Pécs. Pécs is one of my favorite places really in Central Europe because it's so untouristy. It's other than Hungarians, nobody knows about it. But similar to Mykolaiv, which I just showed you, it's a beautiful, beautiful town, also surrounded by a great wine growing region. In the case of Pécs, it's known for its beautiful local porcelain that they make here. Also has a spectacular basilica. It has a half dozen excellent museums. It has a mosque on the main square that was turned into a church. Pécs is another one of these great spots. And I guess what I'm trying to say with these examples, and I went to several others on this trip, we're kind of at a time where I see a trend where people go to places that are very crowded, and then they come home and you say, "What did you think?" And they're like, "Oh, geez, it was crowded." And I'm really like, I'm kind of out of patience with people who go to these really crowded touristy places and then complain about the crowds, when there are so many things in Europe that you can go to that are just an hour's train ride or an hour's drive away, that you could kind of have it to yourself. And I think the people living there would appreciate that too, because it would sort of spread out the demand a little bit. So really challenge yourself to go beyond the big famous places if you can. Maybe the most striking thing that I saw on this trip to the Czech Republic, and it was kind of a pilgrimage, was I got to see the Slav epic. And if you know anything about Czech art, you've probably heard of Alphonse Mucha. He's this great Czech artist who really kind of pioneered the whole style of Art Nouveau in some ways. And he was really famous. He would do advertisements and theater posters. Incredibly talented. If you think of Art Nouveau, you're probably picturing Alphonse Mucha. Well, for the second half of his life, he became obsessed with this project. He wanted to create a series of 20 paintings that tell the story of the Czech people and really the story of all Slavic people. And he spent 20 years or something laboring on this thing. At the peak of his success, of his popularity, he kind of put all other things aside. And for complicated political reasons, he has two heirs, and one of his heirs wants to have the Slav epic in Prague, but the other heir doesn't want to have the Prague epic in the Slav epic in Prague. So it was in Prague for a few years. If you got to see it when it was there, you're very fortunate. But most of the time, it's in this town called Moravský Krumlov, which is in the middle of nowhere. It's 2.5, 3 hours outside of Prague. So it's really hard to get to. But I would say if any piece of art is worth making a full day trip and spend several hours on the road outside of Prague, it would have to be the Slav epic. I was lucky enough to see it in Prague maybe 15 years ago. And being back in the presence of this incredible work was breathtaking. 20 canvases, some of them are basically the size of movie screens, okay? And each one is absolutely jam-packed with symbolic figures and motifs and little details and big grandiose scenes. And I spent, I think, 2 or 3 hours just walking from canvas to canvas, getting sucked into these details. This one, for example, the younger man here is a self-portrait of Alphonse Mucha as a young man. Just an incredibly beautiful work of art. And I think the theme here, the lesson for me as a traveler, is sometimes the really amazing stuff takes some effort to reach, and it's worth the effort. Again, Moravský Krumlov, it's very untouristy because no one bothers to go that far outside of Prague. But if you're an art lover and you love Alphonse Mucha, go to Moravský Krumlov. They just re-signed the lease, so it'll be there, I think, for at least they're saying another 5 or 6 years at least. So it's not going to show up in Prague again anytime soon, probably. But it's really worth making the effort. Now, from the Czech Republic, I had to get down to Hungary for the next part of my trip. And I decided, in a fit of nostalgia, on the way I was going to stop off in a town called Komárno, Slovakia. I am not recommending that anyone else go to the town of Komárno. It's a very nice town. The reason I went is because I went in 1999 on my first big backpacking trip to Europe. I have a very good friend who was in the Peace Corps stationed in Komárno, and I went to visit him there. And it was a very influential moment in my life. Not just traveling to Komárno, but I also traveled with my friend Trevor to a few other places in Central Europe. And if you ever wonder, why did Cameron suddenly take a shine to this obscure corner of Europe? This is why, because of my friend Trevor and the fact that he happened to be stationed in Komárno, Slovakia. So it was very nostalgic for me for the first time in 26 years to go back. And I kind of remember hanging out on this bench with Trevor all those years ago. And one of the interesting things about Komarno is it's attached across the Danube. Komarno is on the Slovak side of the Danube. And then across the river is the Hungarian side of the city. And it's connected by this big green bridge. So you can actually walk from Slovakia to Hungary across the border. And that's what I did. That's what I did 26 years ago to catch my train to Budapest. And that's what I did about a month ago to catch my train to Budapest. So it was very nostalgic to walk across this bridge, snap a selfie of myself with Hungary on one side and Slovakia on the other. And then when I got home, I discovered I had taken the exact same picture in 1999. To be fair, back then we didn't really know how to take selfies. We didn't have this self-facing screen. You just had to kind of hold out your camera and hope for the best. We do a lot better with that now, but I love these kind of, as I'm reaching my old age, I'm enjoying these nostalgic moments. So anyway, that train that I caught on the other side of the river took me to Budapest, which is the last city I'll be talking about here tonight. But boy, there's a lot to talk about. This has always been one of my favorite cities. There's just so much to it. I adore Budapest. It's also a really kind of a complicated place with some really complicated politics. I warned you I bring up politics from time to time, and this is one of those times. You might know, if you know anything about the Hungarian politics, the prime minister of Hungary for the last 15 and a half years is this guy, the guy on the right. His name is Viktor Orban. And you might know that he's become kind of a darling of the American right because he's really led Hungary in a very strong kind of rightward, they would say soft authoritarian direction, in a way that in a lot of ways the Trump administration is kind of modeling itself after. He kind of, Viktor Orban and his party is kind of a model for a lot of these other parties around Europe that are trying to move their country in this direction. You know, he pretty quickly removed some of the checks and balances from the Hungarian constitution when he was first elected. He's exerted a lot of authority over the media in Hungary and really infringed on truly free speech. He's rewritten the textbooks of Hungary to make sure that all the history taught in the country is consistent with his version of history, and so forth. So he's been a really interesting figure, not just in Hungary, but across Europe and around the world. And this is a picture taken just a few days ago when he came to visit. You might have seen he came to visit Donald Trump in the Oval Office not too long ago. When I was traveling around these countries, it was a really good reminder for me. Again, we Americans might tend to be a little narcissistic, right? We think that what's happening in our country is somehow unique. It's not unique. The same movement that brought Donald Trump to the White House twice has taken place across a lot of Europe. Viktor Orban is one example. When I was in the Czech Republic, my Czech friends were telling me about Andrej Babiš, who they think of as sort of the Czech Trump. And he was someone who was a very wealthy oligarch who had become prime minister at one point, fell out of favor, lost an election. And when I was traveling, my friends were saying, we're kind of concerned because we think he might come back. The elections were scheduled a couple of weeks after I got home. And sure enough, you might have seen that Andrej Babiš is again the prime minister of the Czech Republic. And in neighboring Slovakia, my friends were telling me about Robert Fico, who they call the Slovak Trump. You sense the theme here. He was a very wealthy businessman who I think he's on his third run as the leader of the country, but there's been a gap between each one. And so it's really interesting to notice how the trends that we think are American are really not American. They're global, and a lot of them have their roots in Europe, and a lot of them are using the same kind of strategies and have the same philosophy. And I find something a little bit, I guess, reassuring or comforting about that. It doesn't make it okay that these things are happening, but it does make you feel a little less alone, and it provides a lot of opportunities for learning and perspective broadening. And if you can understand a little bit how Babiš works in the Czech Republic or Fico works in Slovakia, or Orban works in Hungary, it can kind of maybe tell you a little bit about how things are going in our country or how they might go in our country. So again, it's a really interesting time to be traveling with all the political volatility in our own country. And a lot of these political changes are actually very tangible. So this is up on Castle Hill. On the right, you see the Mátyás Templum, which is this beautiful neo-Gothic church. The building on the left side of this picture wasn't there about 5 years ago. It's been completely rebuilt. It used to be a kind of a boring building, and now they've kind of gone really over the top, creating a new version of it. And this is really the theme in Budapest in general, especially up on the Castle Hill. Castle Hill is a massive construction zone. Okay, so part of Viktor Orban's vision for Hungary and for Budapest is he wants to turn the castle into a collection of the most grandiose buildings you can imagine. Architects and historians struggle with this because they're not creating the castle as it was at any one historical period. They're kind of mixing and matching different buildings from different periods to create the biggest spectacle, almost as if you were to be building a grand ballroom or something off the east wing of a presidential mansion, something like this. You can see these things are happening all over the world. And the other thing, by the way, I kind of joking, but the Hungarians, part of why they're annoyed about this is historically, the prime minister's office was down in the city in Pest, near the parliament building, among the people. And so they were very alarmed when Viktor Orban moved his office up to the castle a few years ago. And the symbolism was to them very poignant. I want to be above all of you. I want to be at the castle looking down on the people rather than among the people. And so this construction you're seeing is kind of an extension of that philosophy. Now, I'm not saying all of this new construction is bad. Some of it is quite striking, quite beautiful. It's prompted a lot of, things aren't that simple, right? Politics aren't so straightforward. It's creating a lot of beautiful new buildings and public spaces in Budapest. In the city park, just in the last few years, they built this gorgeous new House of Music, which is a beautiful museum celebrating the Hungarian musical tradition and the global music tradition. And then just a few steps away, they built this new museum of ethnography, which literally just comes out of the ground. You can walk up on the roof of this building. So there's some really cool modern architecture happening in Budapest, which is quite exciting. But again, I'm kind of haunted by the politics that are underpinning this. And I will say, and this is the last time I'll talk about politics, but there's the House of Terror Museum in Budapest, which was the building where the occupying Nazis had their headquarters. And then flash forward, when the communists came in, it was also where the communist secret police had their headquarters. It was in the same building. And so that was turned into a museum about 20 some years ago, early 2000s, called the House of Terror. And it was really, I had a very poignant moment updating on my guidebook this year because I wrote the description, again, probably 20 years ago-ish, of this site for the guidebook. And I was walking through reading about how these different authoritarian regimes first exerted their control over Hungary. And I kept getting this very uneasy sense of deja vu and this sense that history doesn't always repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. That's the famous line. And I think it's really silly for people to just hurl insults at each other and say, this person's a Nazi, this person's a fascist. I don't think that can always be a helpful thing. But I will say, if you're a historian, a student of history, and a thoughtful traveler, and you're walking through a museum about an authoritarian regime, and you start to notice some of the strategies that this regime used are not that far afield from some of the things we're reading about in the newspapers in the US today, or that Hungary was reading about in the newspapers 10 years ago or 15 years ago when Viktor Orban was first in power. Understanding that sense of history behind current politics is very powerful. Especially when you're going back to a place. I used to see this site as something that was a part of somebody else's history, and walking through for the first time this fall, I thought to myself, this is making me a little uncomfortable because I'm sensing some similarities with my current experience. Now, moving on to Budapest beyond the politics, this is just for me a delightful place to travel, and I really enjoy just getting up to speed for updating our guidebook on what's going on in Budapest these days. Lots of new discoveries in Budapest. There's always something new here. For example, while I was there, by coincidence, they were opening a brand new Time Out Market, which is this wonderful food hall where all these great chefs from around Hungary have food stands, food counters around the corner, and you can go and order whatever you want and sit at these big communal tables in the middle and sample all these great Hungarian foods. I thought that was just wonderful. Another new museum that just blew me away. Hungary in Budapest, has such a complicated history with so many layers. And there's a apparently very famous photojournalist called Robert Capa, who I didn't really know much about. I think I'd heard the name, but they have a new museum about Robert Capa in Budapest. He was born in Budapest. He was born to a Hungarian Jewish family under a different name. Robert Capa was a pseudonym that he took on later. If you know anything about him, Robert Capa was a guy who, this was his most famous early photograph. He eyewitnessed all of the most incredible historical events of the mid-20th century, starting with the Spanish Civil War. This is his most famous picture from when he was just starting out. And he was there for the African and Sicilian campaigns of World War II. He was there for the D-Day landing. Steven Spielberg used his photographs to help him know how to depict the D-Day landings for Saving Private Ryan. He was there for the liberation of France. He was there for the foundation of the Soviet Union after World War II. He was there for the creation of Israel. He experienced all of these things firsthand. And this beautiful Robert Capa Center in Budapest that just opened a couple of years ago, you can see all of these photographs of that he took and also learn the story of his life. Just a very powerful site. And I love it when a grand old city has a new exciting site like this. And I feel like every time I go to Budapest, that's very much the case. Another thing Budapest, of course, is famous for is its thermal baths. I've always loved this. It's always been my top recommendation for people going to Hungary. But I will admit, they're getting quite touristy these days. This is the Széchenyi Baths, which is the biggest, most famous one in City Park. Used to be, if you went here, you'd be among tourists, but you'd be outnumbered by Hungarians. And these days, it's mostly tourists, I'm sorry to say. And maybe our guidebooks have had some responsibility for that. They're out now selling actually fast track tickets for Széchenyi Baths, which just horrified me that it's busy enough that if you want to pay extra to skip the line, you can. By the way, I always check with my local friends and they say those are not necessary except a few very busy days every year. It's just a way for people to make more money. The other thing that's happening with the thermal baths is one of the other really famous ones, the Gellert baths, are closing. They just closed actually a couple weeks ago, and they'll be closed for a few years. So as a guidebook author, I had to take on the very, very difficult hardship assignment of scouting a couple of new thermal baths so that we have some alternatives for the ones that are really touristy or the ones that are closed. So on one afternoon, I actually did two baths side by side. I know it's a really hard job. First, I went to the Lukács baths, which is very much sort of like the Széchenyi baths, but it's a lot less glamorous. The architecture is less spectacular. It's actually attached to a hospital. These baths are used partly for treatments for people who are patients, but it has a lot of the same features of the Széchenyi baths, and it's far less crowded and far less touristy. And then right next door to Lukács baths are the Veli Bey baths, which are actually under an Ottoman dome. This is an old Ottoman bathhouse going back to the 16th century, I believe, and they've completely refurbished the hot thermal baths under this classic dome, and it's a very beautiful and relaxing place to have that Budapest thermal bath experience. It's a very hard job, but somebody has to do it. And then I'll finish my Budapest section. I love not making just new discoveries, but new to me discoveries. And this is a city with so much to it. And one of the things that really blew me away was I've been hearing about this and finally made a point to go. There's an old mansion that was built by aristocrats in the mid 19th century. The peak of opulence. It was all about ostentatious, showing off your wealth. And it's later was turned into a library. It's a public library that's associated with a university. And so now you can, as a tourist, you can pay a couple of bucks and you can wander through these absolutely breathtaking, spectacular halls that are on par with any kind of staterooms anywhere in Europe, but they're actually filled with students hunched over their laptops and doing their work. And I just thought that was a great symbol for me of what a great city Budapest is, the way that the history kind of layers on top of itself, and that you can always find these little hidden gems. This is not new. This has been here for a long time. But finally, I took one of my local friends' advice and checked it out. And it just reminded me, no matter how much you think you know a place, no matter how much you see of Europe, there's always some more delights hiding out around the corner. And I think the last thing I'll say is I'll just say I am so lucky to work with wonderful friends, both here in the office in Edmonds, Lisa and Gabe and everyone else in the office. But also we have this whole network of wonderful friends over in Europe. And so I just want to finish with sort of a shout out to all of my Czech and Hungarian friends who really made my fall trip a success. When I was in Prague, I got to meet up with Katka and Jana and the other Jana. If you've been on one of our Czech tours, you might have had one of them as your guide. Peter Poltzman from Budapest happened to be in Prague when I was in Prague, so we met up that same night for dinner. And then when I was in Budapest, I got to meet up with Esther and Andrea and Etelka and George. Again, if you've been on any of our Hungarian tours, you might know these faces. And every time I get to connect with these wonderful people in Europe, it just makes me feel so fortunate to be part of the Rick Steves family. And with that, thank you for listening to that whirlwind recap of my trip. And Lisa, I'm ready if you have any questions.
I do have a few questions for you, Cameron, but before we get to that, we need to do a word from our sponsor. And tonight, our featured product is something you had something to do with and something I've recently had something to do with. It is our new Croatia and Slovenia guidebook. It just came out, and I know that you were lead architect, guidebook writer in this, and I just used it when I went to the Istrian Peninsula last month. So I want to say, as somebody who uses the guidebooks, thank you for all your hard work.
You're welcome. Thank you for using it.
Okay, so we have, of course, a lot of questions. People were very active in the chat. I will ask a question that we always get when we have you on, which is what kind of camera do you use, and do you use a filter?
Good question. I have my main, so about 3/4 or more of the pictures were on my main camera, which is a big SLR with the changeable lenses. It's a Sony Alpha 1 A1. And then the rest are on my iPhone. And I don't use a filter exactly, but I do a lot of processing using Lightroom after the fact. And Lightroom has a lot of, the tools are getting better and better. I came home from this trip to Hungary and Czech Republic, and after about day 3, all of my pictures had a spot in the same place. And it's getting easier, and just because there was a hair on my, a piece of dust on my lens, on my sensor. And it's getting easier and easier in post processing to just get rid of those in a quick go. And so I do use Lightroom to do a lot of cleanup and adjust the lights. But yeah, that's it.
But the sky really was that blue.
The sky, some of them I didn't have to do. The second they showed up on my screen, I said, "Wow, that doesn't look real." But that's obviously that's before I even processed it.
Excellent. Okay, Rich would like to know, would you recommend England in the spring with the driving rain, or would you go later if you had the opportunity?
I think my sense of the UK and Ireland is you can have a lot of rain anytime, even in the summer. I did the Scotland research a few years ago, and I planned my whole trip around being there in July because I thought that would be the driest time. And then of course everyone was saying, "Oh, this is the wettest July we've ever had," and I had rain almost every day. And I think with the British Isles, you have to count on some of that. I think the deeper into summer you get, the higher your odds are of some clear weather. I've been told, and my experience is too, May can actually be a really nice weather month. I don't know about you, Lisa. You've spent a lot of time there, but I feel like May kind of can be a sweet spot where you often have some nice. It's not as warm, but you have some nice sunny days. Have you had an experience with?
And sometimes you can run into a heat wave and you're like, why is
Right.
it 85 degrees in northern Scotland? But what I love about May and June is how long the days are,
Yeah.
especially, you've done this, I've done this, driving around. You're absolutely never going to be driving in the dark because it
Yep.
just isn't. So I like
Yep.
that time of year. Okay. Megan wants to know, would you consider Prague, the Czech countryside, Vienna, and Budapest a family-friendly itinerary for a 5 and a 7-year-old?
I mean, yeah, I think it can be. I think you're talking about, especially Prague and Vienna and Budapest, they're big cities. So you want to make sure your kids are comfortable in big cities. We do have in our guidebooks on those destinations, we have children's chapters. I have a whole chapter in my Budapest book of Budapest for kids, and we have one in Vienna and in Prague too. There are lots of activities. I don't think they're particularly unfriendly for kids. For kids that age, I've got nephews about that age, and my instinct would be being in the countryside more might be more fun. You have, go to some castles where they have people in costumes and fun activities and that sort of thing. So a city heavy itinerary at that age, I think could work, but might be a little better a little later. Again, Lisa, what do you think? You've got kids.
Well, I think that Prague and Budapest, I'm not as familiar with Vienna, but I think Prague and Budapest have some really nice public parks
Yeah,
and
they
big
do.
green
Yeah.
spaces. So that would be good. And I would also just say, as a parent, I would rather take my 5 and 7-year-old to Budapest, Prague, Vienna than Venice, Florence, and Rome in the
Yeah.
summer,
Yeah.
right?
Good point.
Okay. Scott Cowan, a longtime viewer, said, you mentioned things that you love. Give us the scoop. What don't you enjoy or what annoys you as a guidebook writer?
Um, crowd. I mean, I say crowds. I'm annoyed by some places that have gotten caught in a whirlpool of social media promotion such that they attract a very superficial kind of traveler who's only there to recreate a photograph they saw someone else take. Um, I take travel and I take the places I go very seriously, and I think I'm really bothered by people who aren't curious, not just aren't respectful, but aren't curious and aren't interested and are just there for the pictures. Dubrovnik is a city I love that I've been to in Croatia. I've been a million times, and it's gotten really popular among other reasons because it was used to film Game of Thrones. And I had a local guide tell me, I get people now who sometimes say, "Can you just do a Game of Thrones location tour with none of the real history, boring stuff?" And I think if you're going for if you're going for that, you're going for the. I mean, I don't like to be judgmental. I honestly believe people travel for different reasons, but I don't have a lot of patience for people who travel that way. I'll tell you where this is coming from. My wife and I, after I got back from this trip, 2 weeks later, my wife and I went to Japan for a week, and we had an awesome vacation there. But I will say Kyoto really brought me down because it's an incredible city and it's beautiful. But you go to these historic temples that are just wipe a tear beautiful and very should be very serene and prayerful, and you have people lining up to take a selfie in the kimono they rented, pretending they're meditating, and it just made me crazy. And I see that in some places in Europe too, and it's just I like it when people try to make a real connection, whatever it is, a real connection that has respect for the place and curiosity about the place. And I think we're kind of running into some really strong headwinds as a thoughtful travel company because that's not the trend right now, especially in some places. It's all about materialism and recreating pictures and collecting things. And so I'll get off whatever. I'll get off my soapbox
Sure.
now. But that's something that really bothers me. It really really grates on me. And I think it's why when I go to these Czech castles, I was in 4 or 5 Czech castles where I was literally out of 40 or 50 people the only non-Czech speaker. And I loved it because I was like, this is what Czechs do for fun. They don't go to Karlstein, which is pretty but empty and doesn't have a lot behind it because it's just outside of Prague. Everyone goes there. They go to Konopiště, or they go to Kroměříž, or they go to some of these Lednice or Valtice. I love that stuff. Sorry,
I
rant
no,
over.
we asked and we wanted to know, and I understand. I saw a woman in a red floor-length gown standing outside the Colosseum earlier, and I'm like, why? What?
If we're complaining, I will tell you one of the things that made me crazy. My wife and I were on the island of Naxos last fall, and there's this beautiful ancient archway. And we saw everyone goes at sunset because it's beautiful at sunset because you're looking out over the whole island and you can see the next island over and the arch is lit up by the sun. And there was a woman dressed up like a Roman goddess, including like a tiara, which was fine. Okay, that's your photo op. But as the sun was setting, she stepped over the rope designed to, you're not supposed to cross because it's an archaeological. She stepped over the rope and took a few steps and turned around so she could be the only person there. And oh man, my wife could tell you, just the steam came out of my ears because it's just so disrespectful and so missing the point. We wanted to take a nice sunset picture too, but to have to be in the center of the picture is a little something that bothers me.
Yeah, somebody in
In a
the chat
costume.
tonight, in a costume. Somebody in the chat tonight was talking about how, yes, it's not socialism, it's thinking about all of the other people that live around you and taking what they need into consideration. And I
Yeah.
thought, yeah, we need more of that in this world. Okay, one last question, kind of the opposite. What was your best guidebook find this year? Whether it was a town, a restaurant, a museum, what really floated your boat?
I mean, the Lego house really blew me away in Denmark. We'd already covered the theme park, the Lego. It was what's really interesting is the Legoland theme park is basically like any other theme park, but it's Lego themed, and then they have a section of miniature. It's really a cool thing, like a miniature European buildings. But the Legoland theme park is that whole concession has been purchased by a company in England that also runs the London Dungeon and Madame Tussauds. It's a money-making thing. And I think I was actually kind of touched by not kind of, I mean, it was really touching to be in the Lego house because Legoland is now part of an international conglomerate. The Lego house is by and for Lego. It's literally across the street from the workshop where Ole Kirk Christensen, or whatever his name was, first invented the Lego. And you really see the difference between a corporate site and a real site. If you could draw that distinction. It's not yes, they make money. Yes, you have to pay a lot of money to go in, but it really has a mission. And I feel like a lot of the mission of a lot of the sites that I don't like in Europe are to make money. And the mission of the sites I do like is they really know what they're about, and they're about teaching something. And the Lego house was just the celebration. And I grew up with Lego, and you grew up with Lego, and my nephews are growing up with Lego. It's this thing that connects all of us. And here's this building that, like, you get 25 million of them to do whatever you want. I mean, there's something, and then there's all these super smart, creative people coming up with fun ideas. Well, if you don't know what to make, here's 20 fun projects you can work on while you're here, And there was just something, it was a celebration of this thing that's so important to so many of us. That's so, anyone our age or older. I was shocked. I thought Lego had been around since the 50s, but I guess they've only been around since you and I were kids, basically, I think. So people older than us might not get it. But anyone our age or younger, it's in our DNA. And it was just, you go to Legoland, you're like, this is fun. Oh, yeah, roller coasters. Oh, those are cool models. Then you walk into the Lego house and you're like, oh, these are my people. They get it, So I wrote a whole blog post. If you ever want to look at my blog, this summer, I did a blog post about the Lego house and about how it because Legos are, sorry, I'm going on and on, but Legos are like, you can do anything with them. So what you decide to do with them says so much about who you are, right? It's like the ultimate Rorschach test. And so I just thought a place that understands that and celebrates it and isn't just trying to make money off it. They did sell me this nice mug, so they are making some money. But no, that stuck with me, and it'll stick with me for a long time.
I love what they're doing right now. They're selling Lego kits at Costco now, and they're like bonsai trees or floral arrangements. So they're made for grown-ups who want to recapture the joy of building things from their youth. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was one of many wonderful memories and wonderful discoveries from this year.
Okay, Cameron, I want to thank you for joining us. As always, it is a pleasure to spend time with you and to hear your points of view. I know our clients, our guests, our viewers enjoyed that this evening, but I would like to thank you personally because I always enjoy working with you.
It's always a treat to work with you too, Lisa. Thank you so much.
So to our viewers out there, I would like to say, please join us next week as we are going to have a destination duel. We're going to pit Barcelona versus Lisbon, and you get to vote. So we'd like you to join us for that. Also, if any of the things piqued your interest tonight about Budapest or Liverpool that Cameron was speaking about, we do have MNT episodes about those that you can go to our website and find in the archives. So again, we will see you next week.